the first session of this conference on definiteness across languages. The first speaker is Urtzi Etxeberria from the CNRS-IKER, and the title of his talk is Definite Determinant and its issues. The case of Basque.
So, good morning everyone. Apparently now I'm the one setting the standards, so you'll see then what you should do, right? Okay, so before, can you hear me? So before I start, in this talk I'm going to be making a division between, on the one hand, the Suletin dialect, which is the most distant dialect spoken in the Basque country, the French part of the Basque country, and on the other hand, the rest of the Basque dialects plus Standard Basque. Okay, so throughout the talk, I'll be using the term Standard Basque to make reference to all these dialects plus Standard Basque, and then we have Suletin. Okay, so that's the division. Okay. The goals of the talk are first to describe the differences between the use of nominals in argument position in both Standard Basque and Suletin. Second, to show verb nouns in Basque are number-neutral of semantic type ET. To provide an analysis of nominal expressions in Suletin and Standard Basque. I'll be assuming that Suletin is closer to Old Basque than Standard Basque is, and I'll try to account for the evolution of the use of the Basque definite article. Okay? And finally, I'll try to show that the Basque definite determiner has non-canonical uses. Okay? So, the Basque definite article is about morpheme that takes the phonetic forms a when singular, as you can see in 1a, motilla, the boy, or ag when plural, okay, the boys. And it always appears in the final position of the nominal expression, either combined with the nominal, with the noun itself as in one, or with the adjective type of phrase. Okay? First, I concentrated on the behavior of nominals and the definite article in the Standard Basque, and then we'll turn to Suletin. Okay? And one of the characteristic properties of Standard Basque is that verb nouns cannot appear in argument position, no matter whether they appear in subject position as in free, Ikakas leabean de Teresa, the teacher came late, Ikakas leak, the teachers came late. Okay? As soon as we limit the definite article, the construction is out. Okay? And it happens the same in object position. Okay? You have the example for a singular and plural. Now the question that one can ask is, if verb nouns are not allowed in this language, how can we express what other languages express by means of verb nouns? Okay? And we know that in English, for example, verb nouns can be used to express kind greetings. In Basque, in order to express the kind greeting, we need the definite article. Okay? And this comes as no surprise, as many other languages, most of the Romance languages also use the definite article to express kind greetings. One of the use of verb nouns in English is the existential interpretation. So, as you can see, 7a and b, John ate potatoes, John drank wine. And here comes what's really interesting about Standard Basque, because in the Standard Basque, in order to get this existential interpretation, we use the definite article. Okay? So in 8a and b, 8a, Anne Goshoki are constituent. The sentence is ambiguous between Anne ate candies or Anne ate the candies. Okay? And it happens the same with the mass term in 8b. Anne gardó eran zuen, Anne drank wine, or Anne drank the wine. Okay? Now, one could think that the reason why we use the definite article in order to get the extension interpretation is because we don't have indefinites. Okay? But this is not the case. As you can see in the example team 9, we have indefinite singular and plural. Okay? And Batzuk, they are perfectly fine. Okay? So this is not the reason why we use the definite article in those cases. And it is important to note also that the existential written of the object definite DPs in the examples in 8 has obligatory narrow scope. Okay? So if we take the example in 10a, where we have a numeral, two modes, when we combine it with an italic adverbial for an hour, the sentence is strange, okay? Because it seems that we are talking about the same modes being killed again and again. Okay? Now, when we use the definite article in 10b, Chatorrak, Nereitak Chatorrak Test, combined with an italic adverbial, the sentence is grammatical. Okay? And the interpretation is that my father killed different modes for an hour. Okay? Now, I said that the definite article can get also the definite interpretation, right? So this sentence will also be ambiguous between an extension interpretation and a definite interpretation. If definite, it will be as strange as 10A, okay? Because it will be getting wider scope over the AT legal verb, okay? Okay, so this is what we have to say about standard Basque. Now we turn to Zuletin, and in Zuletin the definite article appears to be a well-behaved definite article. Okay? So it provides definite interpretation in the subject position. As you can see the examples, la carcelea, the teacher, la carcelea, the teachers. This is just the same as what we have in standard Basque. And in object position also, as you can see in 12b, we don't have the existential interpretation of the definite article. Okay? So the sentence is definite necessarily. And well, this is interesting. This is the crucial point. So if we compare standard Basque and Zuletin with the use of the Basque definite article in object position, we see that there is a difference. Okay? Standard Basque is ambiguous between a definite and extension interpretation. In Zuletin, it is not ambiguous, it is always definite. Okay? So the question is, how does Zuletin express existential critics? Okay? And in order to do so, it uses verb nouns. Okay? But these verb nouns are only allowed in object position. Okay? These are some examples. 15a, for example, Ortuan ikusi bay. I saw cows in the mountain. 15c, Sagare bachidos, stole apples. Okay? And you see that it's in italics, the object in the for example is verb. Okay? Alright, so the fact that verb nouns appear in object position and get existential interpretation suggests that an analysis along the lines of Longobardi 94 may be on the right track, and this is what I'm going to be defending here. Okay? So the assumptions that I'm making are the following. A null element exists if it alternates with one or more phonologically realized morphemes, and if each element of the paradigm contributes a distinct semantic value. DP layer must be projected with a null D. Null D has a default existential interpretation, and syntactically, null structure is expected to be subject to licensing conditions. Okay? We'll get to see that this is the case. Right? So basically, the structure that I'm assuming, and this is really simplified, is this one. Okay? Proposing a full DP with a null D, okay? Which will be occupied by phonetically null digits, okay? NT. Okay? Now, if what I'm saying is correct, this makes some predictions, okay? And what I'm going to do next is show you or give you a more complete picture of Zuletin verb nouns to see that, well, what really happens in these cases, okay? So one of the predictions of the structure that I'm assuming for the verb nouns in Zuletin is that they will be subject to licensing conditions. Okay? And if this is the case, they won't be allowed in subject position. And this is born, as you can see in the example in 16a. K will be the ergative marker, so ikaslek or yegindizu, verb noun, that's out. We need a definite article, okay? Or an indefinite in order for the sentence to be commanded. And this is, again, the same with absolutive case. Okay? These speakers do not agree with this example. Okay? There was a 50-50 choose. But I think that if it's not grammatical, it's okay for me. If it is grammatical, it's going to be okay for me too. Okay? Because it's an accusative sentence, so I could be assuming that the subject is mentioned below. Okay? Alright. If verb nouns get an extension interpretation, they are not expected in any level context, and this is again the case. We need a definite article in order to express kinds in Zuletin. Then the verb noun gets narrower scope. So in 19 you have two examples with an indefinite and the verb, the predicate want. So depending on which scope relation they have, we can continue the sentence making reference to members of the set. Okay? So in the first one, the indefinite will be getting wide scope over the verb want, and then it is possible to make reference to the set. not otherwise. Okay? In 19b, want will be taken by the scope over some. Okay? And the continuation is not. With verb nouns, we have the same. Okay? So it seems that the verb predicate want in this case takes by the scope over the verb noun, and we cannot make reference to numbers of the same. Okay? So it takes narrow scope. In Suletin, I mentioned this for Standard Basque, and in Suletin 2, there are other ways, other means to express existential limitations. Okay, we can use indefinites again. We have singular indefinites and plural indefinites, as you can see in 21b. So if this is the case, it seems that the null B will be part of a paradigm, where each of the members of the paradigm will be contributing a different syntactic or semantic interpretation. Okay, so the definite article will provide a definite referential and kind of interpretation. The indefinites will provide indefinite reading with wide or narrow scope, and then we'll have null D with existential reading with narrow scope. Okay. Further evidence for the fact that these verb nouns are full DVs comes from the fact that Suletin verb nouns can combine with any kind of episodic predicate. Okay. Usually verb nouns are not allowed with really episodic predicates such as break. Okay? Has been argued that, well, they don't accept as internal arguments elements of type T or incorporated type elements. Okay? If the verb noun in Suletin is a real full DP, we expect it to be possible with predicates such as break. Okay? And this is indeed the case, as you can see in 22. Horizontal, contact overstand, peyo podalet, ochilisu, the verb is more predicated classes. That's okay, so as entering conclusions, we have seen that in Standard Basque verb nouns are completely ungrammatical in our composition. Okay? In Suletin they are allowed, but only in direct or preposition with existential reading and narrow scope. And syntactically we've argued that verb nouns in Suletin are full degrees with an OD. Okay? Now, if this is really the case, there are at least two things that we should try to understand. One is how can we account for the inability to use verb nouns in the Standard Basque? And the other one is, are the Suletin and the Standard Basque systems related? And if they are related, how are they related? But before we get to these questions, one of the things we should try to understand is what's the notation of verb nouns in Suletin and the Standard Basque. Okay? One of the things that verb nouns in Suletin are plurals. Okay? And this, well, could make sense, assuming that in Spanish or English verb nouns always appear with a plural number S, and that in the Standard Basque, as we saw, in order to obtain the existential reading, we make use of the plural form of the definite article. Okay? And this happens with counts. But we think that this is not correct. Okay? What is important in the existential interpretation is that they can make reference to singularity or to a plurality. Okay? So in the example of Oggiani could pay, we could be making reference to a singularity or to a plurality. Okay? So what I'm arguing basically is that verb nouns in Suletin and in Basque are unspecified for number of dimension. Okay? They denote the whole lattice basically. Okay? So they can be making reference to atoms or to sums thereof. Okay? Now, if this is really the case, evidence for this, I think, comes from the following. Okay? In Basque, we can combine numerals with verb nouns with nothing in between. Okay? They combine very and this happens, in Suletin and Standard Basque. Okay? So in 25a, we have the noun incarcerate combined with one, but. So we make reference to singularity, but the noun is completely uninflected for number. In 25b, we have 10 student. Okay? So we make reference to plurality, but again, the noun is uninflected for number. Okay? And it happens the same when we combine the noun with other weak quantifiers or indefinites. Okay? As in 25c, with many or with few in 25d. Okay? Further evidence for the assumptions that verb nouns are neutral come from predicative uses. Okay? So in Suletin and the Standard Basque, it is possible to use verb nouns in order to express stage-level predicates. Okay, so we can use, as in 26a, Urtzi shepherd to make reference to a singularity. Oh, yeah. I have 5 minutes left, so I think I have to run. So you can trust me, okay? This is just to show that we can use the verb noun to make to predicate over a singularity or to a plurality. Okay? In both in Sudetin and Standard Basque, and in Sudetin we have the same individual level predicates. Okay? I'm going to skip this. So the generalizations are verb nouns in Basque are specified for number and can make reference to singularities or to pluralities. Verb nouns in Sudetin cannot function as arguments of type E, as they are only based in the direct object position with a substitution indefinite existential interpretation, and they are of semantic type E. Okay? I said at the beginning that Sudetin is closer to all Basque than Standard Basque is. Okay? I'm taking this at face value, and you have to trust me in this again. Okay? What I'm assuming is that Sudetin is a previous stage of Basque. Okay? So the direction of the thing is going, at some point we have verb nouns, now we don't. Okay? And up until now we have seen that, well, we have at least 2 systems in Basque. Okay? One, Sudetin, where verb nouns are allowed in object position, the other one is Standard Basque, where verb nouns are not allowed, and we use the definite article for everything. Okay? For definite kinds and extension limits. Okay? The question is, how did Basque decide to start using the definite article to express existential interpretation? Okay? It is important to remember the Basque nouns. I'm assuming the Basque nouns are neutral, that in Sudetin they are grammatical internal argument position with existential reading, and if this is the case, the definite article in Standard Basque doesn't make any semantic contribution in the existential reading. Okay? So it doesn't add any kind of definiteness in these examples. Okay? It's just existential. Alright, so thinking about all these facts, I think what motivated the Standard Basque to start using the definite article to express existential reading is twofold. Okay? On the one hand, loss of the noun D, and on the other hand, noun morphology. Okay? So we start with the loss of noun D. I'm gonna need like 5 more minutes, if that's okay. Alright, so what I argue is that semantically the Sudetin noun D becomes a very weak form. Okay? It is non-referential and unspecified for number. Right? And it is this vagueness, that is indefiniteness plus number vagueness, which dooms these forms to lose of its semantic indefinite features. Okay? And given that the null D is a null form, it cannot be reanalyzed and it gets lost. Okay? So the appearance of the overt definite article in the Standard Basque in the indefinite extensional object position is a kind of reanalysis of the available definite article as a D with extensional interpretation in these cases. Right? And this makes sense if we consider that the Basque definite article is a phonologically weak element. It appears to be the first immediate proximate phonologically to the null D. It's a suffix, basically. So what we are arguing is basically that we move from a situation like this, where we have a null D, to a situation like this, where the definite article takes the place of this null D. I argue that the definite article is always a D, okay? But now it also functions as the overt counterpart of the otherwise covert indefinite extension in object position. And in this position, if what I'm saying is correct, the definite article has a big function, okay? It applies vacuously. It takes noun, an element of type PT, and it gives back an element of type PT. So there is an asymmetry between the syntax that is asking us to have something more of the noun and the semantics, which imposes indefinite meaning for the definite article. I think I'm going to skip this. Here I just show an additional use that the definite article can have as a domain restrictor when combined with quantificational elements. Okay? So the existential interpretation is not the only non-canonical use that the Basque definite article can have. Okay? I think I can skip this. So this is just to show that that B in Basque is a semantically flexible element that encompasses classical definite uses, but also weaker functions such as the null existential or domain restriction. Right? So in the end, what we are saying is that B in Basque is not always referential. Now, the second motivation is number morphology. And we've seen that bird nouns are number neutral, and there is no morphological number in the noun itself. Okay? We have seen this example. We have also seen examples where the noun combines with the numeral, and the noun is an inflected number. Okay? This doesn't mean that Basque does not possess a number marker. It does. Okay? We have number marker K. But this K cannot apply to nouns directly. Okay? It is a suffix, and as such, it's categorically and phonologically dependent on the presence of the definite article. Something like foyer to express students is not correct. We will need something like this. Okay? Where we have the definite article. So, the reason why Standard Basque starts using the definite article instead of the subjective null B may be due to the fact that Basque begins to mark number morphology explicitly. Okay? And I reckon that this motivation part is emphasized fiction part. Okay? So conclusions. Basque historically grew from a stage where verb nouns were allowed in object position to a stage where verb nouns in argument position are completely grammatical, and the definite article is introduced to express existential interpretation with another scope. In subjective verb nouns, we have argued are full DBs with an empty header paired by phonetically null D. The result is an analysis of D as a semantically flexible element, one that can take up classical definite functions that are referential functions, but also weaker functions such as extension, interpretation, or domain restriction. We have argued that verb nouns in Basque are neutral, and the reason we move from a system like subjective, where we have verb nouns in object position, to a system like Standard Basque is due to a semantic weakening and loss of the null D. So in subjective verb nouns are full DBs with an empty head. The null D loses its semantic features, and since it is null, it cannot be realized and gets lost. And in Standard Basque, the definite article is realized and takes the place of the null D, acquiring the function of the lost null D. And this is it.
So we have 8 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Cole. My question actually about the indefinite article. I mean about the indefinite, sorry, but not about the definite. You said the but and the but so are like indefinites.
Are indefinites.
They are indefinites, but you lost them as one. So do they still have the numeral thing?
Well, okay, yeah. The indefinite, the singular indefinite derived from the number 1. Okay. So I don't know what I wrote. I don't know. But the translation would be A. Like in English.
And can you do generalizations with it? Like a chimpanzee likes bananas? Or would that be weird?
Yeah.
You can do it. Or it's
with
weird.
singular, yeah, you can.
You can, okay. Perfect, thanks.
Thanks. My question is about the indefinite use of the definite marked phrases in Standard Basque. I wonder if you think there's a connection there to the kind level reading.
Here?
Well, so what you show in 6 is that you can get a kind reading out of a definite plural in Standard Basque. And so given that kind terms give rise to weak indefinite interpretations, you don't necessarily need to say anything special about the definite article. You just say that the definite article allows you to build a kind term. That's what you see in 6. And then if you put that kind term together with a predicate, you can also get an existential reading, say, by direct kind predication.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem that I had, okay, so in my dissertation back in 2005, that's what I actually said. Okay? And the idea was that Basque was just in between French and English. Right? So in English you have the graph identification fully not visible. Right? In French you have everything visible except for the extension. You have the dead. And in Basque you have kind, and then you don't see the thread and the extension. The problem that I have is with the verb nouns. So if I'm assuming, okay, so I wouldn't have any problem to assume that for standard Basque. My problem is if standard Basque derived from subjective and for the null be, or from the verb noun, and the verb noun doesn't get kind readings, the correlation is not that neat. But that's my only. So if you read my 2010 papers, I was arguing exactly this. Okay. Maybe there's an option that I could combine the two, but I don't know how.
I'll just ask one quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think the semantics of the null D in Sulatin is. So it's presumably not an existential generalized quantifier.
No, it
because
would
then
be
you
something
have
like,
flexible scope.
yeah, it would be a thing, it would be treated like a predicate, and then we would take this thing from after someone. Yeah.
Thanks. I spent a very, very brief period trying to learn Basque and started reading pedagogical grammars of Basque. And it was claimed there that ending is not a definite article, but it's ambiguous between a definite and an indefinite article, and they had a bunch of examples.
The
Those
singular
like
is not.
specific indefinite.
The singular is not. The a is not. You can't get indefinite verbs with the singular. I think I know the paper you're making reference to. And I mean, I'm not the only one trying to account for this. Okay? There are other analysis that says that when the extension is definite, that's just number markers, right? And this kind of makes sense, right? The problem is, what would you do with mass nouns? Okay? Because with mass nouns, the a is there, right? So you want to say that in those cases, is a singular number marker. Our mass is singular. I mean, then it could be just an agreement thing, right? Could be that it's not that simple. And in order to get the extension interpretation, you need the plural or one you combine with masses. But the a per se is not ambiguous. It doesn't give you. If I say something like, I bought quite drunk the battle. This is just specific. It can't be one battle. Okay? And not because I'm not having. I mean, the example maybe is not the best, but no, you can just.
Does the same hold for predicative uses? So if you say, this is bottle A, I didn't, okay, it was when applied to good.
Yeah.
So there you go.
I skip that part, yeah. It's the same. Here. So I didn't provide examples of standard Basque in these cases, okay? I just provided examples of verb. So as you can see, in both written and standard Basque, you can express states or predicates with the verb noun. Okay? Mina went to marry a shepherd at that time, and with and plural will be the same. Okay? Then in Sulatin, individual level predicates are again expressed by means of verb nouns. This is not the case in standard Basque. Okay? In standard Basque, we need the definite article. Okay? So I think we have two options there. Okay? One would be to say that predicative uses are DPs. The other one would be to say that depending on whether the definite article appears in argumental position or in predicative position, you get a D or something below, small, let's say, number phrase. Okay? So maybe the predicative use is just behaving as a number marker. Okay?
I might see it differently, but yes.
Well, yeah.
That's very interesting.
We should move to the next talk by Oggiani. Thanks to Urtzi Etxeberria. The next speaker is Oggiani from the Universidad de la República, Universidad de Buenos Aires, and the title of the talk is Definiteness in Verb Locative Nominals in Rio de la Plata Spanish.
So, good morning. The goal of this presentation is to study the distribution of a group of singular count nominals that have a locative interpretation in Rio. In Rio de la Plata Spanish, spoken on both sides of the river, which is Montevideo and Buenos Aires. So we will deal with sentences like the ones you see in 1. Rectorado queda en planta baja. B. En este momento el doctor va al quirófano. Este medicamento se vende en farmacia. Let me begin by mentioning that, as you may know, omission of articles in prepositional phrases is a cross-linguistically widespread phenomenon. But in Spanish, this phenomenon has hardly been explored. Indeed, bare nominals in Spanish have been mostly studied in object position. So with this presentation, we aim to shed light on the possibility for Spanish to have covered determiners, either definites or indefinites, weak or strong, in a similar fashion as Serino and Espinal 2015 argued for Brazilian Portuguese. We will account for the distribution of properties of the 3 types of locatives, as you see in 1, and to show that these bare nominals correspond to 3 different interpretations. More precisely, in 1a, we will explore individual expressions that refer to a definite individual, actually. In 1b, these nominals behave as weak definites, as in Aguilar Guevara 2015 or Carlson and Sussman 2005 argue, and in 1c, they are generic expressions and refer to either a kind or a maximal sum. So the outline of the presentation is as follows. First, we will analyze their behavior, their productivity on both sides of the river, and also at a macro variation level. And we will close the presentation with some insights regarding bare nominals in general in Rio de la Plata Spanish. So our hypothesis for this first group of bare nominals is that they refer to a singular definite entity. As we will see right away, they belong to a restricted lexical class, and they present 2 types of implicatures. A familiarity implicature, similar to the one proposed in Svan 2009 for English, and a unicity implicature. So we assume the traditional view that no determiner is required for argument within Romance languages, as in Longobardi 1994 and Clerc 1998. First, let's go through a series of diagnostics that show that these bare nominals refer to an individual entity. We will replace the determiner or make it explicit in order to analyze its kind of definiteness. So then, if we replace a determiner without altering the semantic value of the nominal, the only option is to consider it a strong definite that allows for a unique reading, as you see in 2 and 3. Rectorado queda en planta baja is analogous to el rectorado queda en planta baja, fui a secretaría por un trámite, is analogous to fui a la secretaría por un trámite. So given that they are analogous to rigid designators, they can occur there in subject position, which in Spanish is only possible for proper names, as you can see in 4. Rectorado queda en planta baja, is analogous to Rosario, queda en la provincia de Santa Fe. As for the contexts where they occur, even though they are possible in generic and episodic contexts, their nature as entities is more clearly seen in those contexts where particular and precise events are expressed, as illustrated in 5A, la reunión del claustro se hace a las 17 en rectorado, B, tesorería estuvo cerrada ya. Another piece of evidence comes from VP ellipses. So considering that they refer to uniquely identifiable individuals, these nominals do not allow sloppy reading. Then in 6, the only possible interpretation is that Sara and Facundo are in the same administration. And for the same reason, plural subjects in 7 do not admit a distributive reading. So the only interpretation in 7 is that Sara and Facundo are in the same administration, that is, in the one of their university. Regarding the discourse referential properties, they introduce a discourse referential entity, and as such, the accusative pronoun picks up the nominal as its antecedent, and that you see in 8. Ya estoy en Vedería, la encontré cierta. On the other hand, despite their referential capacity, they do not allow for modification, neither relational adjectives nor qualifying adjectives or prepositional phrases. So, 9, el trámite lo hice en Vedería nueva, universitaria, de la escuela, is ungrammatical. Possible explanation for the incompatibility with any modifiers has to do with the uniqueness implicator, in the sense that the bare nominal refers to an individual location that is unique within the speaker's domain. So this is why an indefinite would make the sentence more awkward, as you see in 10A, en este momento el decano está en un rectorado, but 10B is fine. Furthermore, they can only be modified by non-restrictive relative clauses, since they add information about the entity referred by the bare noun, which is the antecedent, and they reject restrictive relative clauses given their impossibility to restrict the antecedent denotation. So, 11A, el trámite lo hice en Vedería, que en primer piso is fine, but 11B, el trámite lo hice en Vedería, que en primer piso is ungrammatical. It now becomes important to mention that this value as a unique individual was previously studied in the Spanish grammar as a dialectal feature. So in fact, it has been argued in canon 1945 that these nominals already by then belonged only to restricted cases and stopped being used. Also, they give rise to familiarity implicator in as much as they refer to an identifiable location by speaker and hearer. This so-called dative value, argued in Span 2009, accounts for the fact that bare nominals are interpreted as definites that take the location or place of the subject as another point. And so 12A is interpreted as they were in the secretariat of their place of work, and 12B is interpreted as I went to the rectory of my university. As for lexical restrictions, they comprise unique and identifiable locations that are part of an institution, something like the sort of institutional departments. So this is why 13A is not possible. El doctor se encuentra en dormitorio, en oficina, but 13B is fine. El contador se encuentra en tesorería. So to sum up this section, these tests aim to show that these nominals behave as singular definites. Let's now move to the second type of nominals, which include expressions that receive a weak definite reading. As you can see in 14, Pedro no habla por celular cuando está en ruta. We understand that Pedro doesn't talk on his mobile when he's driving on the road. And in 15, en este momento estoy en consultorio, we understand that at the moment I'm treating patients in the office. Let me point out that these constructions have not yet been attested in Spanish. Indeed, only well-known cases such as in bed or in prison are mentioned in the Spanish grammar. So as for the analysis, our analysis fits what has already been proposed in the literature, in the sense that these nominals do not refer to a particular entity, but rather to designate typical or habitual activities. So it's also a common agreement that Greek expressions present a semantic enrichment meaning. We argue that the absence of the determiner produces a change in the conceptual domain of the name, which is possible due to the functional nature of these nominals. That is, that they refer to artifacts. So following Urtzi 1995, functional names incorporate semantic aspects that connect them with typical events, which are associated with the function and are part of the telic way. So then in 16a and 16b, prototypical activities are conveyed. We now present some arguments that account for the weak interpretation of these bare nominals. The standard diagnostic, since Carson and Sussman 2005, has to do with sloppy reading, in BP ellipsis sentences, as we also seen for the first group of nominals. So these nominals can receive a sloppy interpretation. We know in 17 that both Ana and Pedro are traveling on the road, and also in 18 we understand that football players are playing on a football pitch. The second piece of evidence shows that weak expressions only accept to be combined with animate subjects with a human feature, which enables them to be engaged in an activity, as the contrast between 19a and 20a shows. So 19a, sus hijos están en jardín de infantes, is fine, but 20a, los personas están en jardín de infantes, is not. The third test has to do with discourse behavior. It seems that they are not a good way to refer to individuals if we want to continue talking about them. As illustrated in 21, the pronoun seems to reject the noun as its antecedent. Juan está en cama y se va a quedar en ella hasta que se cure. So it's not really good, since it's not a referential expression. For the same reason, the pronoun is or that in 21b, B, is the good anaphoric expression that picks up the whole verb phrase to be in bed. Juan está en cama y eso lo pone muy nervioso. So continuing with pronominalization, it is not possible for the bare nominal to be picked up by the adverb, i.e. or there. This behavior reinforces the idea that these nominals do not refer to a location but to an activity, as you can see in 22, la doctora Bruno está en un quirófano, la doctora Bruno está ahí, is that. The fourth test is on modification. As you see in 23, modification turns these constructions ungrammatical. Indeed, all modifiers seem to block its weak reading. Neither adjectives that create subclasses of objects nor adjectives that modify entities are allowed, as you can see in 23a, no te puedo hablar porque estoy en ruta peligrosa, Nacional. Please note that this behavior is slightly different from the weak definites studied in Aguilar Guevara, which are possible to combine with client-level adjectives. So the only modifiers these bare nominals admit are aitalic modifiers, such as prepositional phrases headed by durante or during, which accounts for the unbounded nature of these nominals, as in 23b, estuve en ruta durante 2 días para ir a Puerto. Regarding relative clauses, as expected, they do not combine with restrictive nor with non-restrictive relative clauses, as you see in 24, estamos en ruta que queda al sur de la provincia, is that. So up until now, we've gone through some tests to show that bare nominals can also display a weak reading. It's now worth mentioning that weak nominals seem to show a bit more productivity in Uruguayan Spanish than in Argentinian Spanish. So then sentences in 25 are bad in Argentina but good in Uruguay, and you find some in the handouts, such as 25A and B. Los niños están en piscina lunes y miércoles, so meaning the kids are at the pool to have their swimming lessons Mondays and Wednesdays. Gana Brasil, pero la celeste sigue en cancha, meaning Brazil is winning the match, but Uruguay is still playing the pitch, and therefore we still have chances to beat them. So we think that this micro-variation phenomenon also comprises some other expressions that typically occur in spontaneous speech in Uruguayan Spanish, such as bare nominals in object position with an indefinite reading, as you see in 26, papá está ocupado, está haciendo parrillero, or 26b, Cecilia terminamos la vergüenza recibe. and other with definites that allow article drop in very, very spontaneous contexts, as in 27, yo por gripe no llamo médico, me quedo en casa. So, to round up this section, nominals headed by the preposition in Rio de la Plata Spanish display a weak reading along the lines of what has already been proposed in the literature, as in Aguilar Guevara and Carson and so forth. Let's move to the last type. So, this group comprises no Revere nominals that leads to a generic interpretation. As illustrated in 28, los estudiantes estudian en biblioteca, two different interpretations can be associated with bare nominals. Sometimes a kind interpretation is available, other times a maximal sum of all the individuals of the class is available. In the sense, we follow Silino and Espinal 2015, who claim that in Brazilian Portuguese, the determiner carries a noun feature and may be covert. So even though our data will give us only a first glance of the phenomenon, we think it goes along the lines of their proposal. As for the evidence that shows that they are generic expressions, please note the grammaticality of 29, estudian en Biblioteca de la Facultad de Psicología. In this sentence, the covert determiner does not enter reference to a particular entity, nor to plural entities, and this is why it is incompatible with the object modifier. In fact, as you see in B and C, when we replace an over determiner which yields a singular and plural definite reading, the sentence turns grammatical. So then, as we intend to show, these bare nominals seem to be only associated with kind or maximal sum. The second piece of evidence comes from their affinity with generic contexts, in which habits and general tendencies are expressed, but no particular events. As you can see in 30A, la ropa del gas se limpia mejor en tintorería. It's a generic sentence that has a stage level predicate. And here the nominal can refer to either a kind term or to a maximal sum, as the options below, B and C, with the over determiner illustrate. As for a third argument, generic reference is also reflected in sentences containing edited verb phrases. So you see that in 31, they allow a sloppy interpretation and thus they occur felicitously in contexts in which more than one individual can satisfy their descriptive content. Thus, in 31, el queroseno se vende en ferretería y el antioxidante también, we understand that kerosene and antioxidant may be sold in different hardware stores. We can also observe the lack of a strict identity of the referent in their possible distributive and non-distributive reading, as you can see in the two possible continuations with plural subjects, as also Laca 1991 points out. So in 32, we may understand that Raúl studies in one library and Sarah in another one, or that they both study in the same library. And this also holds for definite kinds and maximal sums, which you also find below. Regarding anaphoric expressions, as seen in 33, los alumnos estudian en biblioteca, pero Victoria las encuentra aburridas. The pronominal form las is able to pick its antecedents in the discourse. So this behavior suggests a maximal sum reading. In fact, if we replace the plural determiner, then the maximal sum interpretation becomes available as in 33b. Los alumnos estudian en las bibliotecas, pero Victoria las encuentra aburridas. However, with the singular pronouns, sentence 34 sounds less acceptable. Los alumnos siempre estudian en biblioteca, pero Victoria la odia. It seems that the pronoun forces a definite singular reading, so that Victoria hates a particular library which is incompatible with this generic locatives. Modification of these nominals seem to be restricted, and thus it deserves further exploration. For now, we argue that they do not combine with individual object modifiers, such as qualifying adjectives or augmentative suffixes, as you see in 35A, el jabón de tecador se compra en supermercado caro o en supermercadote. Meanwhile, they do accept to be modified by PPs or relational adjectives, which are associated with kind modification, as in 35B. El jabón de tecador se compra en supermercado barrial o en supermercado de barrio. The same occurs with a kind reading in 36. It is blocked with qualifying adjectives and the suffix when the over determiner is replaced, but it is allowed with kind modification. And as for a maximal sum reading, all the modifiers allow a maximal sum interpretation, as you see in A and B. So, el que acabamos de comprar, se compra en los supermercados caros o en los supermercados es fine. And finally, with respect to the productivity, generic expressions are lexically restricted. They are only possible with some nouns that refer to functional commercial establishments, as you see in 38. Esto se vende en librería, panadería, frutería, supermercado, and so on. So as you see, nominals headed by the preposition n behave as generic expressions, either they refer to a kind or to a maximal sum. And just to briefly conclude, so in this interpretation, we wanted to look at the distribution of these three types of locatives in Plata Spanish. An aspect that should still be explored has to do with the question of why the omission of the article is possible if the same meaning is conveyed with the article, or may be conveyed with the article. As for expressions that refer to an individual, the omission of the article is only possible if there is reference to an institutional department, which is unique within the utterance situation. As for weak readings, the omission of the article may be a consequence of grammatic labor, given that counterparts with an article do not convey a weak interpretation. And as for the last group, the question remains open. And, well, last, we argue that far from being exceptions, the distribution of air nominals in Rio de la Plata Spanish seems to announce a tendency towards a wider range of air expressions than has already been stated. That's it.
I forgot to mention that this is a joint work with Inés
Yes.
Kuguel from la Universidad Nacional de Sarmiento y la Universidad de Buenos Aires. So now it's time for questions. We have 7 minutes. Do you have any questions?
Thanks. So you were saying at the very end there that you get pretty much the same interpretation regardless of whether you have an FR or whether it's dropped. I was wondering whether you looked into if there were any kind of socio-linguistic factors which could affect whether people drop them.
We are not sure yet. I mean, definitely it happens in very informal and spoken Spanish. And I would also say in Montevideo and Buenos Aires, so not specifically in Uruguay and Argentina, so in like both capital cities. But so far, that's what we know. Yeah.
And no one's done any work on that? Or?
No, this is, yeah, so in some sense it's a novel joint work because it hasn't been done yet. Yeah.
It's a PhD.
Yeah.
Thanks. There were some new tests that I had never seen, which is a lot of fun.
Okay.
I should apply them. Well, one thing I was wondering about was the difference between the kind, the third type and the second type, because you didn't have the same tests for every type, and that makes it hard to pinpoint where the difference lies. Is it true that the main difference is the modification?
The main difference is modification between second and third unit, and semantic enrichment.
And semantic enrichment.
So that I think that is like the most, let's say, compelling evidence.
But the semantic enrichment, you have this very nice test where you actually show that inanimates can combine with the second type, but you don't show that they can combine with the third type. That's one test.
What do you mean?
So the inanimates, so you cannot do los crayones están en el jardín de infantes.
Yes.
That's a very nice test.
Yes.
But you didn't do that test for type number 3. And for type
yes,
number
you're right.
3,
I did, but it wouldn't work.
It wouldn't.
Yeah.
It would work.
Yeah, of course it would, because it has not to do with this human feature.
And for the third type, you also have this fun test that seems to be kind of showing the same thing. Los alumnos estudian en biblioteca, pero Victoria la vi. I suppose you can not do that second.
No.
Thanks.
Thank you. Another type of test would involve, not for exactly the same, but would involve adding modifiers. So often when you cross linguistically, when you can drop a determiner and get a kind reading, the result is not fully productive. So I'm just wondering if you kind of try the same thing, like in English, if you have he's in hospital, it's fine, but not he's in big hospital. So there's a lot of data in anticipation as well. So I wonder if you get similar phenomena in the cases you've looked at.
Yeah, but you mean with modification like big?
For example, yes.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't, that is not allowed like for Greek definites. So that's one of the tests we have so that we show that they behave as Greek definites. But the third group, you do find modification. So either the kind or maximum, admit some kind of modification depending on these two readings. So I'm not sure if I understood correctly there.
Well, for example, if you have a bare nominal that you're getting this sort of definite reading with, whether you can still do that in case the bare nominal has a modifier.
I don't think you can.
Right.
Yeah, no.
So
no modifiers at all.
So good. So what would the consequences of that limitation be for your account?
Yeah, I'm not that sure yet, but I think there's more of like an activity reading that you do not find in other weak definites. So I'm not sure if they are two different kinds of weak definites, but what I see is that these weak definites at least are a bit different from the ones studied in Guevara, because modification is not allowed, and you get more like the sense of this is an activity, which you may not find in my work, I guess. Yeah.
Sorry for holding the mic. Just to kind of follow up about the modification cases, is there any chance that modification gets slightly better if you put a whole clause in a very kind of habitual reading? Because apparently, so with Greek P-drop, with P-drop in Greek, you can get modifiers of the bare noun, but only, well, for some speakers, but only if you have a kind of very, very good habitual reading. So something like John drives on New Road every week, or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think so.
No,
but I've had one informant that accepted like something like National Road, like he's driving on the National Road every day.
Right.
So it was a bit tricky. I didn't consider it here, but some may accept it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, there is no additional vote from the speakers. Now it's a turn of Annie Rose-Bill from the University of California, Berkeley, and Oggiani, also from the same university. The title of the talk is Number Marking and the Definite Interpretation of Bare Nouns in Teotihuacan, given by the faculty.
Slides on your device. Okay, so we'll be talking about about number marking and indefinite interpretation and definite interpretation in Teotihuacan by Zapotec?
And we're interested in the following questions in this presentation. So first, we're interested in asking what mechanisms regulate the interpretation of bare nouns in languages without definite articles, and in particular the question of whether bare nouns in such languages are freely definite or indefinite, as is sometimes reported, possibly according to context. Second, we're interested in the question of how bare noun interpretation in languages without a definite article compares to its counterpart for bare nouns in languages with a definite article. And so we want to know in particular what accounts of bare noun interpretation in well-studied article languages like English can predict about languages without a marked definite. And the language that we'll be interested in here today is Teotihuacan Zapotec. This is an interesting language because it is like English in having a singular plural distinction, but it's unlike English in lacking a definite determiner. So this is a language where you very frequently see bare nouns as arguments. This is by far the most common type of argument, as we have in 1 and 2. In 1 we have run horse, and in 2 we have run plural horse. Okay. So what we'll claim in this talk is that bare nouns in this language actually behave precisely as predicted on the Neo-Carlsonian theory developed by Teresa and Kuguel, and no doubt familiar to many of you. So in this language, definite and kind level readings are freely available for bare nouns. Existential readings, on the other hand, are more tightly restricted. So we'll show you that number plays a crucial role in regulating indefinite readings, these existential readings, but not definite ones. Okay, here's the outline of our talk. So first, Julia will say some words about Teotihuacan Zapotec. Then I'll talk about the Neo-Carlsonian theory. Then Julia will show you how bare nouns and plurals behave in this language. And we'll talk about bare singulars, the question of whether there's an indefinite article in this language, and then conclude.
Thanks. So, Teotihuacan Zapotec is a variety of Valley Zapotec. Zapotec as a whole is part of the Ottomanian language family. This particular variety of Zapotec that we're looking at is spoken by about 3,000 or 4,000 native speakers, the overwhelming majority of whom are bilingual in Spanish and Zapotec, and there's also an increasing number of speakers who are also fluent in English. The language is canonically VSO in word order, although we're seeing a lot of SVO as a common alternative word order. There are several linguists working in the community, lots of projects ongoing, including a talking dictionary and a revised alphabet. You can see in the photo here, the people who are shown here are all members of the revised alphabet project. They're all native speakers, except for me. And they have been working on revitalizing their own language. And then there's also a project on patterns of Spanish Zapotec code switching that's in progress. So you can get a little bit of a better sense of where Teotihuacan is. There's this map here. Here's Oaxaca City, and Teotihuacan is about 20 kilometers off to the east. And this is what the city center looks like. So you can see the archaeological ruins and the colonial church and the sacred mountain in the background. In terms of elicitation, we have data from 4 speakers. 3 of the speakers are where the data was collected in Mexico, and 1 of the speakers lives in California. We use translation tasks between Zapotec and Spanish for the speakers in Mexico, and between Zapotec and English for our speakers in California. In the photo here, you can see me with 2 of the speakers who live in Teotihuacan, but they're also parents of the speaker who lives in California. We also collected felicity judgments in context, and several different types of prompted narratives, including stories like all about his own, and also scenarios that were acted out, and then the consultants were asked to narrate them. And then we are in the process of creating some more storyboards for further elicitation.
Okay, so now let's talk about the theoretical background that will bring to these questions. So, as is very well known, so bare nouns in English have several different interpretations. They have a kind level interpretation like in 3, a generic interpretation like in 4, and an existential interpretation like in 5. And so any account of the behavior that we see in 3 through 5, these different readings, has to explain how the different readings of bare nouns arise and why only these readings arise. So the theory that's developed by Teresa in his very well-known 98 paper goes as follows. So starting with mass nouns, the idea is that mass nouns inherently denote kinds. That's their basic lexical denotation. Kinds are modeled as individual concepts. They're type SE. So if you take a kind term and you give it a world argument, then you have a type E element, which you can then just feed in as an argument to a predicate. So that's what's happening in 6. Gold is rare. You just take rare, which wants to apply to a kind. You take gold, you give it a world argument, and then just a function application. Okay, well, for mass nouns, certainly you can also talk about properties associated with those mass nouns. So in order to model that, we want to take kinds and map them to properties. And so to do that, Kierkegaard introduces this little operator, which he pronounces up. So up is defined in 7. So what it does is it takes in a kind, and then when we apply up to that kind, what we get out is the number-neutral property corresponding to the kind. So basically, the property that holds of all parts of the sum corresponding to the kind. Okay. So what about existential readings? Well, developing ideas from Carlson, Kierkegaard proposes a special composition operation that applies as the kind-denoting argument combines with the predicate. This is derived kind predication, or DKP. So DKP is introduced in 8. What happens here is if we have a predicate which applies to objects, not to kinds, and we have something that we want to give it as an argument, which denotes a kind, a sortal mismatch, we repair that by this interpretation rule. So what this says is that we understand the application of P to K as existential quantification over the intersection of the property version of K and P. Okay. So the existential quantifier, which is introduced here by DKP, is not an existential generalized quantifier. It just applies when you do function application. And so it has narrow scope obligatorily. And that explains why we have obligatorily narrow scope for bare arguments. So for something like 9, John didn't find gold. The only reading of this is one where we have the negation outside the existential quantifier. And that's because the existential quantifier comes about via DKP. So partially similar mechanisms to this are proposed by Kierkegaard for the generic reading. I'm not going to put those here on the slides, but you can ask it. Okay, what about count nouns? Well, count nouns are taken to have a basic property type denotation. So singular count nouns denote singular properties, that's to say sets of atoms, and plural properties denote, plural nouns denote plural properties. So the cool thing about plural properties is that they have supremum, and we can use their supremum to reconstruct the notion of a kind from a plural property. So that's defined in 10. So we take a property, and we take a world argument, and the down operator applies to that property and returns the intentionalization of the supremum. And that is the kind. Okay, so what this lets us do is treat bare plurals as derived kind terms using down. So for something like 11, cats are common. We take the plural property cats, we apply it down, that gives us a kind term, and then we feed that into the kind of predicate common. For something like 12, I don't see cats. Here we have 2 steps. First, we take the plural property cats, and we map it to a kind term. That's happening here. And then we do derived kind predication, which gets us narrow scope existential quantification. So essentially, we go from the property to the kind and back to the property. Okay. So 2 additional pieces of the story. One is blocking. So according to Kierkegaard, there are, in fact, several different types of type shifts which might apply to NPs proximalistically. So there's the iota type shift, which builds definites. It builds maximal definites in particular, things that bring us together today. And there is the existential type shift, which builds existential generalized quantifiers. And then this here is down, so this gives kinds, it gives those individual concepts. Okay, so why don't any of these type shifts apply to bare singulars? We know that they don't, because if they did, then bare singulars would be freely admissible as arguments. So first, for down, there's a problem when we try to apply this to a singular. A singular property doesn't have a supremum, so we can't take the intentionalization of the supremum and get a kind. So we can't apply down as undefined. The interesting question then is what rules out iota and what rules out the existential shift? And so what Kierkegaard proposes is that these guys are restrained by blocking. And the blocking principle is stated here in 16. So what 16 says is that if you have a type shift which might apply to an NP, you need to consider whether there's a lexical determiner that does the same thing. And if there is, then you can't use the type shift. Okay, final piece of the story. So if there's multiple type shifts that are in principle applicable to a given entity, what do you do? Here the idea is that the choice among them is not totally free, it's regulated by a ranking principle. And the version of the ranking principle that we're adopting is one that's argued for by Vanita Dial in her 2004 paper. So the idea is essentially that there is a preference for the iota and the downshift over the existential shift. These things are said to be more meaning preserving, so they're more something light, if you will. And so if a less meaning preserving type shift is available, then we can't use the weightier, heavier existential one. Okay, so then the interpretations of English bare nouns come out in the system like this. So kind level readings are available for mass nouns and plurals. They're not available for singulars. Things that have kind level readings allow narrow scope existential readings by derived kind predication. Definite readings for bare nouns are out across the board because the is around. If you want a definite reading, you should be using the. And wide scope existential readings are going to be ruled out by a couple different things, actually. So for bare singulars, that type shift is blocked by the indefinite article. And for plurals and mass nouns, the ranking principle is playing a crucial role. So here, we basically have a way of getting to the kind level reading, and so the existential reading is blocked. Okay, so what are the predictions for languages without a definite article? So here, this basically comes directly from Vanita Dial. I've reprinted here the blocking principle and the ranking principle, so you can look at them. The effect of the blocking principle is like this. So if you take out a definite article from a language like English, well then bare nouns should totally be able to type shift via the iota as well as via noun. So iota is a great choice, and now it will be unblocked. Second, there's an effect of the ranking principle. So now an iota shift is always going to be defined, and that iota shift is then going to always be there and always be outranking the existential shift. So bare plurals and mass terms should never allow wide scope existential readings in a language without a definite article. So here's the predictions, just concentrating on mass nouns and plurals. We'll come back to singulars. So we expect kind level readings, we expect narrow scope existential readings, we expect definite readings, we do not expect wide scope existential readings. And we'll now show you that this pattern correctly describes the behavior of Teotihuacan Delphi Zapotec, bare nouns and plurals, mass nouns and plurals.
Alright, so let's have a look at how this works in Teotihuacan Delphi Zapotec. So, as Amy Rose pointed out, mass nouns and bare plurals can function freely as arguments to kind level predicates, like common and rare. So we have común na nis and rarte na or. And also for bare plurals, común na the base, the base, extinguir, as predicted. The narrow scope existential readings are also available, as expected, via DKP. So here we gave the consultants the context. My husband has shared a joke with me, and I told it to my class. When I get home, he asked if anyone laughed, and I have to report that sadly, no laughing happened, not anybody laughed. And so we get ket bajis the beaten spiel. Also as predicted, we cannot get a wide scope existential reading. Instead, we have to have a second clause. So in the case that we want to say that a tanker crashed and oil spilled out, but some oil didn't spill out, we can't simply say bila ate tank chikru biji set, per ket biji set. We have to have a second clause, per yu utubru set ket biji. So there was also a little bit of oil that didn't spill out. Similarly with bare plurals, we find the same thing. We can't just say some dogs are howling, but some dogs are not howling. We have to have the second clause. Kasiad the beck, peryu the beck, ket kasiad. So we have to have again, there are dogs that are not howling in the second clause. We can also get definite readings as predicted. So here we have an anaphoric bare plural. So we can see that it's introduced first here in the story. While they walked, they saw butterflies, de maripos. The frog always liked to go out, it jumped, it went in the bucket. Meanwhile, that dog was looking at the butterflies, and here we have the maripos, again referring to the same butterfly that was introduced earlier in the story. And we have the same case for bare mass nouns. So in this example, this was one of the elicitations that I acted out. So I had some juice and some water on the table, and I poured the water into the cup, and this is how the consultant narrated what was happening. Yu hug, yu nis, So in summary, we have exactly what was predicted in Tesla by Zapotec. We can have the kind level readings, narrow scope existential readings, definite readings, and we cannot have wide scope existential readings. So what we see here is that we have an important class of indefinite interpretations that are unavailable to bare plurals and bare mass nouns. So we don't have a complete neutralization of definite, indefinite distinctions within Tesla by Zapotec.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about bare singulars, which we've left out of the story so far, because there's a slight complication with bare singulars which bears mentioning. So this has to do with kind terms, singular kind terms. So a lot of languages are able to use a singular with kind reference. We get that in English in the so-called singular definite generic, like the Gopher's widespread or Babbage invented the computer. So singular kind terms have been noticed for a long time to diverge from their plurals in their allowance for existential readings. So we get an existential reading with that bare plural kind term in 31A, gophers are eating my tomatoes. But we don't get a similar reading in 31B, the gopher is eating my tomatoes. So 31B only allows a reading where there's a particular definite gopher that I'm blaming for this outcome. So the restriction of existential readings that we see in 31B suggests that singular kind terms cannot undergo derived kind predication. We're not going to talk about why that is, but there's an interesting discussion of that from different perspectives, both by Kirkia and by Dial. So what we're interested in is the predictions for languages without definite articles. So in a language without a definite article, what do we predict for bare singulars? Well, we think that there will be a kind level reading, given what we've seen about singular kind terms in other languages. We don't expect that there will be a narrow scope existential reading, however, given that kind terms, when they're singular, do not seem to be able to undergo that DKP sortal repair. We do expect a definite reading by exactly the same mechanism as for non-singulars. We'll just have our iota type shift. And we don't expect a wide scope existential reading, again, because that existential type shifter is going to be outranked by the iota. And so what we'll show you now is that this pattern, again, correctly describes the pattern that we find in Zapotec. Okay, so first, kind level readings. So kind level predication can be carried out in this language either via the bare plural or via the bare singular. So here we have a minimal pair, guk te bez extinguir, or guk bez extinguir, either way. We also very frequently have definite readings for bare singulars. So on this slide we have an anaphoric definite reading and some unique definites. So in 33, I have an apple and a mango. We'll talk about this in a second. But the mango is sitting on a chair. Okay, so here we're referring back to mangoes introduced in the previous clause. So also if you want to say things like the sun is very far away, we just have bubij, sun, bear. Or the Pope lives in Rome, here we have Pope, bear, uniqueness definite. Okay, so like other bare nouns, bare singulars can't be used in context calling for wide scope existential readings. So here in this context we have 6 frogs, 5 of them are in the basket. We want to say that there's one that's not in the basket, so we try just this sentence, which is the negation of a frog is in the basket. So here we have frog, bare singular. We cannot use this in this context. This sentence with the bare singular does not convey there's a frog not in the basket. If we want to say there's a frog not in the basket, like before, we get this special piece being added. We essentially get one being added. And that's the thing that we sometimes lost, that we'll talk about in a moment. The really interesting behavior of bare singulars has to do with narrow scope existential readings, however. So we showed you that bare plurals allow narrow scope existential readings by DKP, but it turns out that bare singulars do not. So in the same context, we want to say no laughing happened, no student laughed, or no students laughed. There's no intersection of laughers and students. We can say that with the bare plural, so no laugh, plural students, but we cannot say it with the bare singular. So the only interpretation of this sentence, 37b, so no students, not the case of student laughed, is that one student didn't laugh. We think that's just the regular singular definite interpretation shining through. So there's no narrow scope existential interpretation. So in summary, we get exactly as predicted for bare singulars. We do have kind level readings, so like frog is extinct. We do have definite readings like Pope lives in Rome. We don't have wide scope existential readings, like there's a frog not in the basket. We also don't have narrow scope existential readings, like there are no students left. And so what we see is that bare singulars diverge from bare plurals in exactly the way that's predicted by the neo-Carlsonian theory, but which is right here, they lack narrow scope existential readings. Okay, I want to quickly mention though, there's a very important caveat that we need to make in this, which is, so back looking at this, what we're saying is that you're not going to be able to get narrow scope existential readings for bare singulars using DKP. You may, however, be able to get those readings or very similar ones using some other mechanism. And we think this is in fact the case. In fact, we think it's possible via incorporation. So, the reason that we think that there's another mechanism beyond DKP involved with the interpretation of bare singulars is that there's an effective argument structure. So we know from studies of incorporation in lots of languages that only internal arguments, and in particular, only themes can incorporate. And it turns out that this effect that we just showed you, where you don't have narrow scope existential readings for bare singulars, that is an effect that you see clearly only when you're not looking at internal arguments. So here we have the predicate laugh, which we take to be an unergative. So we would not expect the subject of this predicate to be able to incorporate, and that's where we very clearly get this judgment that you can't have a narrow scope existential reading. If, however, we move to looking at, say, objects, then we find that you can get a narrow scope existential reading for both singulars and plurals. So here we have two versions of every tourist wants to meet a famous person or famous people, and both of these are totally well-formed as descriptions of tourist one having a general desire to meet celebrities. So here we have narrow scope with respect to both the subject quantifier and with respect to this intentional verb. So we think that this is a special behavior of objects. We think that the fact that a narrow scope existential reading is available for themes, but not for agents, suggests that this language permits semantic incorporation. And that, in fact, makes it very similar to Hindi as Nina has described. Okay, so the final look at the interpretations of Teotihuacan by Zapotec bare nouns is as shown in this table. So we have kind readings across the board, we have definite readings across the board, we have narrow scope existential readings for non-singulars, modular incorporation, and we don't have any wide scope existential interpretations for bare nouns. And so the upshot is, the interpretation of bare nouns in this language is exactly as expected on the neo-Carlsonian approach. Okay, final salvo. Is there an indefinite article in this language? So far, we have been, I hope, careful to describe this as a language which doesn't have a definite article. So let's now look at the question of whether there's an indefinite article. So I want to immediately clarify why we take this question to mean. So we are interested in an element that lexicalizes the existential type shift. And in this language, like in many others, the best candidate is a word which means or has historically meant one, and that's this word te. So there are a couple of behaviors of te which make it look really similar to classic indefinite articles, which are expected if what it does is lexicalize this shift. So first of all, it shows an anti-familiarity effect. So if you have something like a dog is chasing a rooster on the patio, that's this first sentence, and then you want to say the dog looks hungry, you can say Charmelian, bec, but it's very strange to put in te, bec. So one dog. And one consultant comments, with te it means another dog. We also get an anti-uniqueness effect. So if we have a referent known to be unique, like the Pope, so we take our the Pope lives in Rome example, we put in a te, same kind of weirdness. Again, a consultant comments, well with te it sounds like there's more than one Pope. Okay. So, thinking about what this te word means, we also are interested in the scope properties. So te is also like a classic existential generalized quantifier in that it has variable scope, and we see its variable scope, for instance, with respect to negation. So it can have scope over negation, like in 42. So in 42, I'm trying to say there is a mistake that I didn't fix, and that's what's giving me a regret after I've sent a paper off. And so I can say not make good mistake. That's fine with the wide scope existential reading. I can also get a narrow scope existential reading though. So if someone has asked, did Maria buy a chicken? I don't want to give a negative answer, but I could say Maria didn't buy te, bet, one chicken. Okay, so I can have wider narrow scope for this guy. I'm going to just go through this very quickly since we're out of time. So the examples that we've shown you with te so far are all singular DPs. And in these cases, it looks very much like we have a classic indefinite article. We have scopal flexibility, we have maximized presupposition effects with respect, or with competition with the iota operator. This determiner has a more complex distribution in plural DPs. So it can exist in plural DPs. These plural DPs seem to be partitive, and there's some connection between partitive readings and demonstratives, like this one. So here we have some of the tortillas te, get, can. So these are an area where we're currently investigating. So what we want to say at this point is that the interaction with numbers suggests that te is an existential generalized quantifier, perhaps only when it has a singular complement, and apparent plural complements might reflect hidden partitive structure. So something like 44 might mean if you need one portion of tortillas. Okay, so what's the upshot of including te in our account of this language? Well, actually shockingly minimal. So what te does is it gives us an alternative explanation for why this reading is unavailable. So why can't you have the wide-scope existential reading of a pair singular? We don't have to appeal to ranking in this case, we can appeal to blocking. So at the same time, blocking by te does some, but not all of the work of ruling out the wide-scope existential readings, since it doesn't seem to be a simple existential generalized quantifier with these guys or those guys. Okay, very quick conclusions. So we've talked about number and we've talked about definiteness. So the central role of number here has to do with kind to property mapping. So plurals can be interpreted as kind terms. They can undergo direct kind predication that gives weak indefinite readings. Singular kind terms resist DKP, like English singular definite generics. However, semantic incorporation can yield weak indefinite readings for singulars, but it can only do that for internal arguments. And so what we see in the TDBZ effects is I think, very clean replication of what Dayal has found for Hindi and Russian in a very different type of language. Okay. Regarding definiteness, the differential availability of type shifts is key for us. So the iota type shift is freely available, which enables definite readings across the board. There doesn't seem to be a corresponding existential type shift doing any work in building existential generalized quantifier readings. So we've given a story where that type shift, say, exists, but is blocked in any case where it might apply. So it's either technically blocked, there's a flexible determiner you could use instead, or it's outranked, and so that's why you can't use it. So I want to just close by pointing out that our findings are actually in line with Dayal's contention that there might not actually be an existential type shift. It might be only an iota type shift, which is available to Bernard's pessimism. Thanks.
Some minutes for questions? Here?
Can I just shout? Is that right? If I remember correctly, but I can be completely mistaken, the original story about narrow scope bare nominals for plurals in English was, in CONICET, was not the ranking. It was a last resort mechanism where ranking didn't play a role. What CONICET needed ranking for was to make sure that every single plural first went to kinds and then shifted back and then went to existential. But the ranking principle did not do what, it was not responsible for narrow scope. It's only afterwards, for Hindi, that Dayal needed to kind of extend the ranking principle a bit more, and she needed it.
Well, so what ranking, I don't know if this is on, what ranking does for Kierkegaard is it allows him to give an analysis of something like, John didn't find parts of this machine. So the idea is that parts of this machine, it's a bare plural, but it doesn't correspond to a kind. So he will say, in that case, you can't use my other type shift because it's blocked. You can't use down because that plural property doesn't correspond to a kind. And so in just that circumstance, this lower ranked existential reading comes through. But the important thing about that is that that's a wide scope existential reading. That's what Kierkegaard wants to do with ranking.
Yeah, but he also really needed it to make sure that everything went to kinds, because there is actually in the end what DKP does is to allow for existential type shift. That's what DKP does. It goes first to kinds, then existential.
Well,
And there's actually no reason to go
It's not the
to.
same as an existential type shift. So the existential type shift in this system builds quantifiers which can take variable scope, right? It just builds a regular generalized quantifier. And so DKP does not do that. DKP will only issue narrow scope. So yes, both of them, I mean, if you write it in logical form, there's an existential quantifier in both of them. But in one, you're really building this quantificational DP, which can have scope with respect to things in different ways. And the other one, you're doing this like local sortal repair, where you're throwing in an existential quantifier in the logical form.
But existential type shifts will always stay class resort according to any analysis.
Existential
And it will
type
always
shifts-
have existential type shifts that are applied just to save the type. Will always be last minute things you do, and they will always take narrow scope anyway.
No, that's exactly, Kirkia would not agree with that. So the reason that he wants to have an existential type shift is to do things like John didn't find parts of this machine, which has wide scope with respect to negation.
Yes, true. Okay, thanks.
Actually, we are out of time, so maybe we could continue some talk on